At least the Jimmy Stewart version had that giant rabbit who ran the savings and loan.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to this very special non-denominational holiday fun fest edition of the Springfield Googolplex, the movie podcast for Simpsons fans. Each week, we talk about a movie parodied on The Simpsons. Maybe it was The Simpsons that introduced us to the film, or maybe when we finally realized, hey, that's where that Simpson joke comes from. Regardless, each week, we pick one that at least one of us hasn't seen or hasn't seen in a while, watch it, and come together to discuss. I'm your host, Adam Scholes, and joining me as always is the George Bailey to my Uncle Billy, my co-host, Nate Storing. How are you doing today, Nate?
Feeling honored to be compared to George Bailey, but I'm sorry that you're Uncle Billy in this scenario.
No, he's so sweet and yeah. I mean, he's not the sharpest tool in the shed, but he's adorable.
Got a lot of pet squirrels and stuff.
Yeah, and a crow. We'll get into it. But and since this is our very special holiday episode, we also have a very special guest joining us this week. He's the co-host of one of Canada's top film and entertainment podcasts, the Movie Podcast. Ladies and gentlemen, it's Daniel Baptista.
Hello there.
How are you doing today, Daniel?
I'm doing great.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it is my pleasure. I love what you both are doing with this show, and I am honored to be here on this non-denominational episode. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. This week, we watched Frank Capra's It's a Wonderful Life from 1946. You might remember this movie from such Simpson episodes as Season 2's 2 Cars in Every Garage and 3 Eyes on Every Fish, and Simpson and Delilah, and The Way We Was. Season 3's When Flanders Failed, and Bart the Lover, and Dog of Death. Season 5's The Last Temptation of Homer. Season 6's The PTA Disbands and Fear of Flying. Season 8's My Sister, My Sitter. Season 9's Natural Born Kissers and Miracle on Evergreen Terrace. And Season 11's Beyond Blunderdome and Grift of the Magi. Needless to say, this is clearly one of the top referenced films on The Simpsons. So, Daniel, one of the things that we love to do on this episode is we ask the person who brought the film to the other person. We'd like to ask them to sum the movie up in a sentence, but since you're our special guest, we're going to bestow that honor onto you. So how would you...
Put you on the spot.
We're going to put you on the spot and bestow you with this wonderful honor. If you had to write a short, Twitter-length summary of the film, how would you describe it?
I would say, the man wishes he was never born and sees what life is like without him.
Beautiful.
I think that pretty much sums it up. Although, and we're going to get to this. It's very late in the game that plot point comes up, but we're not jumping ahead.
It's very true.
That's part of the beauty of the movie, though. I think. Anyway,
we'll get into it. We'll get into it. Yeah. Okay, so Daniel, I mean, obviously, I asked you to be on the show because you're a friend of the podcast and everything, but I also found out that you're a big fan of the film. So what is your history with It's a Wonderful Life? Is this something you grew up watching? Is it something that you came to later in life? What's your sort of story about it?
So I definitely grew up watching it. It's one of those films that growing up watching cable TV, obviously when everyone still had cable TV, that's a film that was always on. But my biggest memory of It's a Wonderful Life is actually when I was really, really young. My dad and I and my sister were going Christmas shopping, and my mom loved this film growing up. And there was a bunch of other films that she loved, and we actually had to special order them on VHS cassette. And we gave it to her on Christmas, and we still have that VHS cassette of her opening it up and being surprised because movies like this, when they were re-released, it was a big deal because when they weren't in circulation, you couldn't find them. So to actually own them, and that's the copies, we still have those VHS copies downstairs. Not that I watch them anymore, but the fact that we had it and that's what we used for 10 years. We watched those VHS cassettes, and then we upgraded to the DVD version, and then the Blu-ray version, and then now with the 4K remaster that's out. But that really is my biggest memories. I think that was very much bestowed from my mom, who loved the film growing up. And we're in an era where I think all of our families kind of grew up watching it as well too, so it's been part of their kind of zeitgeist growing up, and then coming into our generation, it's been a known entity for everyone, which makes sense why I think we see it referenced so often on The Simpsons, because it very much is in the DNA of everyone growing up who watches Christmas movies. That is the Christmas movie you watch.
Yeah, totally. I mean, this is one of my dad's favorite Christmas movies, and I remember the year he sat us down to watch it, and it's you're right. It's funny that it is this sort of cultural touchstone for a generation, and then that generation sort of bestows it onto the next. Nate, what's your story? Because I'm pretty sure your story is a little bit similar to mine in that you came to this a lot later in life.
Yeah, so my family didn't really watch it growing up. My parents weren't big like movie people. We didn't own almost anything on VHS. I think I've talked about this on the podcast before. But
apart from Black Beauty.
Yes, except for Black Beauty. Oh yeah, we had Black Beauty. So I was introduced to it by my wife, who's American, and she grew up with it, right? And her family loves it as well. And so I think I watched it maybe for the first time when I was in college or maybe soon after graduating, and like immediately fell in love with the movie and just was really touched by it. I think for me, and you know, this is something we'll talk about more, but I think I cry at weird parts of this movie. And I think it's partly because Frank Capra really gets to me, and his whole take on like the American dream and the power of the individual and all that sort of stuff like hits me in this particular way. And so I'm often crying like pretty early in the movie, like the inspiring speeches and stuff. So that's the part that always stuck with me. And ever since then, we've like watched it every single year.
I love that.
Adam, what about you? Do you have history with this movie? I mean, you mentioned that you were sort of late coming to it as well.
Yeah, so as I said, this is always one of my dad's favorite Christmas movies, but weirdly, like, we never watched it growing up. We didn't get a copy until I was also in university. And I went home one weekend to like put up our Christmas tree because that was always a big thing in our family. We got a real Christmas tree and we put it up, you know, the first weekend in December. So I think I came home for the weekend to do that. And we were doing the classic thing of like, oh, what movie should we watch tonight? And we had already, you know, watched The Santa Claus and all the other stuff that me and my sister always watched. And so my dad's like, well, why don't we finally sit down and watch It's a Wonderful Life? It's, you know, one of my all-time favorite movies. And so we did. And the thing to understand, though, is that this was happening about 2 or 3 weeks after a long-term relationship that I was in ended. So I was not necessarily in the best headspace to begin with. And as much as this film has a very uplifting ending, there's a lot of darkness in this movie. So watching this movie when you're kind of depressed and at a low point, it was a very different experience, I think, than most people probably have watching it. And as a result, it sort of tainted my feelings towards the film. So I didn't revisit it, honestly, since then. It wasn't until watching it for this show that I kind of came back to it. So even though it's something that I'm obviously familiar with, and like I said, it is my dad's favorite Christmas movie, it's funny, my sister did not enjoy the movie either. I think she actually like left halfway through because she found it so boring.
My sister's not big on it either. She likes it, she respects it, but she's like, I don't want to watch this.
Interesting.
Well, and so there's been other years where we're trying to come up with what to watch, and because I want to humor my dad, I'm like, well, why don't we watch It's a Wonderful Life? And my sister's like, oh, no, we're not gonna watch that boring, depressing thing again. Like, no, I'd rather rewatch The Santa Claus 3, and which, you know, that's not worth watching at all. But
I mean, there's some parallels between both these movies, though. There really are.
So anyway, so yeah, that's all to say that this is one that I was a latecomer to, and this is not made into the annual rotation. So I was really looking forward to sort of coming back to it and sort of examining it now with fresh eyes. Before we dive more into the film, though, I do also want to circle back to the whole Simpsons connection. Daniel, what is your relationship with the Simpsons?
You know, I'm a huge fan of the Simpsons. I don't think I'm going to come anywhere close to the hold that both of you have on it. But it's just one of those shows that when I was growing up, I was lucky because we grew up into the best generation of The Simpsons. So the episodes that were always airing on TV, because that would be a show that whenever it would get syndicated on another network, I'm like, oh, I'm just going to watch a random episode of this. So like, I don't think I've ever watched The Simpsons beginning to end. I feel like I've watched the first 10 seasons of the show in the most random order because you would watch it whenever it was on TV and whatever channel you were on. But my biggest connection to it is, weirdly enough, in my grade 10 history class, my teacher would always put it on in the background. We had like one of the TVs in the corner of our classroom.
Oh, interesting.
And whenever we would like be working, like if it was whatever we were doing that period, or we were doing some like solo work, he would put on like an episode of the Treehouse of Terror or just one of the random DVDs or VHS cassettes that he had, and we'd just be watching it in the classroom. So I always just, whenever I think of The Simpsons, I weirdly associate it with grade 10 history class, which is so bizarre, which is extremely
That's
bizarre.
funny.
But
I mean, that is funny, but also too, like, at the school that Nate and I went to, The Simpsons was literally part of the curriculum because in grade 9 we studied the monomyth and the hero's journey, and so we watched Star Wars, which is sort of like the de facto, it's written to be exactly the beats of the Joseph Campbell thing. But there was an episode of The Simpsons that deals with that, and so we watched that, and then I there were a couple episodes that I distinctly remember like taping and then donating to the English department so that they could, like the Hamlet episode and stuff. So yeah, Simpsons in high school, part of the curriculum. I'm 100% behind. So
Oh yeah, definitely. But yeah, but now mostly whenever I'm watching The Simpsons, just like myself or Shay or Anthony will just put on an episode while we're just hanging out or chilling, because it is such a comfort show in that way too. Or it's this show you put on like, oh, I'm just going to eat some lunch or eat some dinner, and you put something on because you don't want to pay attention too much because you're familiar with it, but you just want something that is comforting to watch, right? And I think The Simpsons, especially that first, those first 10 seasons are some of the best, animation and stories on TV.
And is there like a specific movie parody moment that like sticks out to you of like you distinctly remember seeing first in The Simpsons and then discovering the movie later on?
I definitely think, Citizen Kane is a big one. And then obviously with It's a Wonderful Life, there's so many of that in like Mr. Burns and everything too, being Potter.
Totally.
Yeah, reading that list of episodes that references this, you get a sense of just how impactful and meaningful this film obviously was to the staff as a whole on The Simpsons. I mean, Nate, I don't remember where this ranked in the large database that you put together, but this feels like this has to be right up there with Citizen Kane and The Wizard of Oz. I mean, just the number of episodes that I listed in the intro there. I mean, that's quite a lot.
So right now in our count, and still kind of floating around a little bit, but it's like number 8. So it's in the top 10,
Which is, when you consider the fact that this is a holiday film and not Star Wars, these sort of the most iconic films of all time,
right?
That is pretty remarkable.
I mean, like, for the record, again, right now it is above Psycho. It's above 2001: A Space Odyssey.
Oh, I was going to say 2001 is probably up there too. Is another big one.
Yeah, exactly. Above Planet of the Apes, which we've already covered.
Well, to that end, Nate, why did you decide to choose this film of all of the films for a non-denominational holiday special? Why It's a Wonderful Life? Especially if it's a film that like you didn't necessarily grow up loving.
Yeah, I think this movie is a really beautiful movie. It's a movie that, again, I cried throughout this entire movie. I counted it the last time I watched it. It's 5 times.
Oh, wow.
And every time I watch it, it brings me something different. That's one of the things I love about it. Something different stands out to me. Mm-hmm. And, in terms of The Simpsons, I do think that there's actually like a lot that you can learn about The Simpsons from this movie as well. Daniel, you mentioned like Mr. Burns. Like, we'll talk about that a little bit more. But also even just like the way they tell the story, I think, is very Simpsons-ish. The structure is like exactly the same as the Simpsons episode, where it's 90% downhill and then 10% uplifting at the very end, right? And it's like this amazing magic trick where, you're watching something so depressing for a lot of it, where it's just like compromises and, like things not going the right way. And then at the end, they just have this one moment where you're like, and then it was a happy ending. And you're like, that was so satisfying. But probably if you think about it a little bit more, it's like, actually, there was a lot of things that didn't get totally worked out. That like if you watched another hour, maybe, there'd still be some problems. So anyway, I think it's a very, very interesting movie in its own right, and also has a lot to say about The Simpsons.
Well, to that end, I want to get to my scorching hot take about this film.
Boy.
So here it comes. I warned Nate that there was a scorching hot take coming up, so I hope you guys are ready.
I'm ready. I'm so excited to hear this.
It's in all caps in our notes document.
All right, here it comes. Adam's scorching hot take about Frank Capra's It's a Wonderful Life. Pretty good movie.
Damn.
No, I mean, look, I went into this with reservations because, like I said, my previous associations with it are not from the best time in my life. And it's a movie from the 40s, and movies from the 40s tend to be stylistically and, structurally very different from the type of film that we're used to today. So I was really sort of gearing up for it to be a bit of a slog. And I was pleasantly surprised at how much I did overall enjoy it. However, because there's always a however. And it's interesting that, Nate, you bring up the sort of structure of it, because I think the structure is really weird to me. And I think if it were to be remade today, which God forbid, I hope they never do it, it would be handled very differently, because the whole premise is like George Bailey contemplates suicide, and then he's shown what the world would be like without him and realizes that he's really important. That's really only the last 20 minutes of the movie. Like, you don't actually get to that point. But, like, the key premise that everybody remembers from It's a Wonderful Life, and that has been parodied ad nauseum, and, like, there's the Muppets have done it, that 70s Show has done it, the Simpsons have done it. All of these things throughout the last 60 years, 50 or 70 years, I'm bad at math. But all of these parodies over the years, that's the part they parody, and it's literally, like, the last 30 minutes of the movie. And so this is my real scorching hot take. It's not really a Christmas movie, because I'm sorry, if only 20% of the movie, not a bad take. If only 20% of the movie is set at Christmas, I don't think that constitutes a Christmas movie. That's my hot take.
It's interesting though.
So many Christmas movies fall into that bucket.
No, but see, that not the ones I like. All of my favorite Christmas movies are distinctly about Christmas. They take place solely on mostly on Christmas. And I'm also up there with like Sound of Music is not a Christmas movie. I don't understand how people say that's a Christmas movie just because they replayed it at Christmas. It has nothing to do with Christmas. Nazis, defeating the Nazis is not very Christmas-like to me. But anyway, that's a whole other argument for another episode. But truly, I do think it's really interesting that this whole thing that everybody remembers of the film really only happens in the last 20 minutes.
Well,
or
so
30-ish minutes.
On that note, there's actually a really good reason for that. And
I'll
tell you all about it.
We're going to get to it. But Nate, we always like to start our episodes with the sort of background to the film, the history of the film. How did we get there? Take us on a journey. Introduce me to, the origins of It's a Wonderful Life and Frank Capra.
I guess I'll just start with the back of the book of the short story that this movie's based on, right? So it's based on this short story called The Greatest Gift by Philip Van Doren Stern, who apparently was mostly a Civil War historian, but he wrote like a couple books, and this is one of his books. So the back of the book just says, on the night before Christmas, a mysterious stranger saves George Bailey from a moment of despair by giving him a precious opportunity to understand the difference that his unassuming life makes to those around him and to the world. That's it. And it actually sounds almost exactly like your one-sentence description, Daniel, as well.
I totally didn't just read that before. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. But yeah, no, it's very true. Like when you really boil this movie down, it does come to that. But like we were saying, it really is the last act of this film, which I think makes it, perfect for sitcoms and different shows to parody it or use that structure. Because I feel like so many sitcoms you would see will do like a bottle episode. It's like, hey, how can we keep something fresh and different? Like, oh, let's do an episode where the main character was never born, and you get to bring your characters into different scenarios that we haven't seen them before, right?
Yeah, totally, exactly. And so the short story is literally just the last act of this film. Basically, it doesn't have any of the backstory.
Wow,
interesting.
It starts with him on the bridge. He meets a stranger who is not an angel, incidentally, in the short story, but just a mysterious stranger who then grants his wish, and then he goes back to town. And it's all the things most of the things you see in the movie where he sees the building and loan is gone and he meets his wife and his wife has a different life. So that's actually what the short story is.
Okay, interesting.
So I actually read it in preparation for this because it's not very long. And it's a good little story, but definitely I feel like the big thing that the movie did is it added all of the backstory, the first 2/3 of the movie, basically.
Yeah.
And then it also really heightens everything. Like the stakes are a lot higher in the movie than in the book. The book's a little bit more subtle and not so extreme one.
Right.
It has that decidedly like post-war 1940s style of like the drama is so much larger and the stakes are so high, and I do think that kind of dates the film somewhat, but it also sort of adds to its charm.
Right. Is like, does Clarence have more backstory? Because like the movie opens with like the Milky Way or like the stars in the sky. Like, is there anything like that in the short story as well too, or is just like he's a stranger?
He's just a stranger. Doesn't even have a name.
Oh wow!
And not distinctly an angel or anything. He's just a guy who shows up on a bridge and is like, don't do it. He doesn't jump in the water either. he just kind of stops him, and then George makes his wish and he makes it come true. And that's it. The thing that like strikes me about it is that, this isn't a very exciting take, but it's a lot like A Christmas Carol, right? Mm-hmm. But like the thing that struck me is that it's almost like, do you know the character Bob Cratchit in A Christmas Carol?
Of course.
Yeah. So it's like what if the ghost visited Bob Cratchit instead of Scrooge, right?
Right.
That's kind of what this story is it's like he's the everyday guy who works at the bank and is a good person, has a nice family, all that sort of stuff. He's not the miser, but he might also be in trouble. And like that's, I feel like, the what if that this movie sort of comes out of. This also has a crazy story about how it actually became a movie. Do either of you know this at all?
I know nothing.
No.
I know nothing.
So this is wild. Basically, Philip Van Dorenstern, who's the author, couldn't get this thing published, right, at all. So eventually he just decided, I really love this story. I'm just going to print it on pamphlets and send it out to people as a Christmas card. He printed 200 himself, sent it out as a Christmas card, and it somehow, I guess through his agent or something, ended up finding its way to RKO, and they bought the rights.
Wow.
So pretty wild. And then 3 different people took a shot at the screenplay. None of them really kind of stuck. It didn't get made. And that's when Frank Capra eventually bought the story and the scripts for his new company after he got back from the war in like 1945. And so like that's how it kind of found its way to him. And he also got really excited about the story.
That's fascinating because I don't know if you know this, tying it back to A Christmas Carol, which, for the record, that's my de facto Christmas story.
Sure.
Like
the Muppets version, of course.
Of course.
Especially the Muppets version. But my grandfather worked in radio, and so growing up we had a lot of old radio broadcasts from the 40s and earlier. And so I grew up listening to these old radio broadcasts of A Christmas Carol, and my dad read me A Christmas Carol at a very early age. And then, yes, of course, A Muppets Christmas Carol, the greatest Christmas film ever made. Don't fight me on it. It's the greatest. But A Christmas Carol, similarly, Dickens was basically, he had a string of flops when he wrote that, and basically nobody wanted to touch it. And my understanding is that he basically was like, I know I've written the best thing I've ever written. I'm just going to self-publish this. And I'm going to go all out. And he like decked it out with like gold foil and these like elaborate illustrations. And he just sort of said, I know that this is going to be a success. And sure enough, he was right. I think there's like some stat of it's like the longest continuously in print book of all time or something like that.
Wow.
But it's so interesting that like this story, which certainly owes, some of a debt to A Christmas Carol, like you say, Nate, has such similar origins of like the author just knows that they've got something special and just takes that risk, and it obviously pays dividends. So
it's also interesting seeing just how, both in A Christmas Carol and, It's a Wonderful Life, we're seeing two characters. At Christmas Carol, we have a very rich character, but in What's a Wonderful Life, very much not the case. But we're seeing a person just really brought down to the base of their humanity and just trying to survive. And it's always interesting setting that around Christmas time. Because at the end of the day, it's like you want to feel like joyous and happy and holly and jolly, but it's like you're also having someone who is just going through like the most crucial moment of their life and getting through the other side of that. So I'm curious, like with A Christmas Carol, can you still tell that story? Will it still have the same effect, even with It's a Wonderful Life, if it didn't take place at Christmas time?
Yeah, that's a really good point, Daniel. I think, because you're right, it's both of those stories, as much as they have these beautiful happy endings, they very much are just like, let's break these characters down to build them back up again, which is not a particularly like festive thing, but I think that it sort of speaks to the fact that as wonderful as the holidays can be for a lot of people, they are also these times that are sort of mixed with melancholy. And, as I've gotten older and formed my own traditions, I miss the other things of like moving out on my own and not being with my family necessarily, or the family members who are no longer with us. So like the holiday tends to be tinged with this sort of like light and dark.
Well, and I think the interesting thing too is I might be, I'm kind of talking on my ass here, so we'll just cut this if I've got it wrong. But I think that A Christmas Carol actually helped kind of reinvigorate interest in Christmas as a holiday.
Yes.
Period.
That is accurate.
Right? It like before that, it was kind of just like this thing that was around. It wasn't really like thought of as a big holiday, and it sort of brought back a lot of traditions that like were kind of just in these little pockets in England and in other places and made them a big deal. The whole idea of like Christmas spirit is kind of like partly from that story. So it's like, I think it is, intrinsically tied to what that story is all about,
Well, but this is not an episode about A Christmas Carol.
It's not.
So Nate, tell me a little bit more about Frank Capra. The famous joke that my dad always made was like, Frank Capra, Capricorn. He made these really cheesy, schmaltzy, emotional movies, which this movie certainly has moments that are, could be described as cheesy. But what's his story? Where did he come from? Because apart from this movie, I don't know anything else that he's made.
Really? Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
So by this point, he is already like a very celebrated director in Hollywood. He's already won like a few Oscars and been nominated for others. He's made It Happened One Night, Mr. Deed Goes to Town, You Can't Take It With You, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and then World War II happens.
I didn't realize he directed Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. Okay, I'm familiar with that film, but I didn't realize that was a Frank Capra joint, as it were.
Yeah. Well, and another Jimmy Stewart sort of collab, right? And very much in the spirit of this, like all of his movies have a lot about sort of like capitalism, but like he's not really anti-capitalist, but he's sort of, always talking about the little guy and concerned about like the people like Potter, right? The people who are sort of hoarding wealth and their political connections. He's very skeptical of Washington, right? All of that sort of stuff. So that's kind of something that runs through all of his films. He's the son of Italian immigrants, so kind of in some ways lived that American dream, which you can kind of see in this movie, rising up through the ranks and like doing what he loves to do and all of that kind of stuff. But yeah, right before this, he actually served during World War II in the propaganda arm of the U.S. military.
That would explain the section where everybody goes to war in this movie. I was like, this feels odd and out of place, but that sort of explains why.
Right. But and we have to know how everyone did their part, right? Like that's the whole thing. Yeah, so he did a whole series of movies called Why We Fight, which was literally like making the case to the American public of like why they should fight in World War II and following the various battles and that kind of stuff. When he came back after the war, he was sort of nervous about getting back behind the camera because he was kind of more playing, I think, a bigger picture sort of role. And I think the thing that struck me is that you can really see in this movie that it's kind of him going back to his comfort zone, right?
Right.
It's like all of the people involved, like the cast, he's worked with everyone in the cast. All of the crew are all the people that he worked with on some of his biggest hits. Like in particular, You Can't Take It With You. It's like there's a lot of shared people between those movies. But then at the same time, he's clearly changed a lot. Looking at this behind the scenes stories, it seemed like he couldn't stop micromanaging this production. So like famously, there was a big fight between him and the screenwriters. Because I said, before RKO kind of commissioned these scripts, they didn't quite get it, right? So he commissions yet another screenwriter duo, actually, Francis and Albert Hackett, to write a new version. But they eventually find out that he's rewriting their script afterward with this guy, Joe Swirling. And so they actually walk out of the production. They're like, we're not going to finish it, right? And these are very good screenwriters. I think you can kind of still see a lot of their fingerprints on the film. They wrote The Thin Man. So they're sort of doing like the Dashiell Hammett sort of thing. And so like a lot of the dialogue has that kind of snappy noir thing. Lots of like jargon. It's very poetic in a weird kind of way. But yeah, he was like rewriting all of the script. And they had to like do mediation and all this sort of stuff. Jeez. And eventually he actually got a writing credit on this movie as a result. It's the only movie, I think, that he produced, financed, directed, and co-wrote. But then same thing happens with the cinematography. The cinematographer, longtime collaborator, he also ends up walking off the set, and Frank Capra gives it to his assistant.
Yeah, there's two credited directors of photography or whatever in the opening titles. And I was like, that seems odd for a movie like this anyway. It's not like a big budget Marvel movie or something like that. It's, not to say that the cinematography isn't good, but it didn't seem like something that, required two cinematographers. But I guess that would explain why.
Yeah, it's always interesting when you hear about these stories behind productions because, especially with a film like this, like we've had this in our collective unconscious for like 60, 70 plus years, you never think about what did it take to make this, right? So it's not
Totally.
until like afterwards you're just like, this movie's considered one of the greatest Christmas films, one of the greatest films of all time, but you don't think about like there was a lot of trouble behind this production. You never think about that. You only think about that final product.
Yeah, exactly. And so really this is kind of like a turning point for Frank Capra. And he makes like one more, I think, major production, A Hole in the Head. And that's pretty much it. Wow. This is one of his last major movies. This is the last movie to get an Oscar nomination. So this was 1946. He died in 1991. And he didn't make another film of note until like he passed away, basically. Like you're saying, Daniel, it's just really interesting to think of this movie in that light of being kind of like the twilight of this guy's career. It's really contentious behind the scenes, and yet the product is this Christmas movie that's so beloved.
Yeah.
I want to sort of dig into the beloved factor, because my understanding, and Nate, correct me if I'm wrong, is that this movie was maybe not so beloved when it came out. Like, it really found its audience much later in its lifetime. So is that accurate? Was it well received when it first came out?
Yeah, so it was just really mixed. It did okay at the box office, but I think one of the big problems is that it had a huge budget, right? It was, done by this brand new production company that Frank Capra started up. And the budget for 1946 was $3.7 million, right? So,
Holy.
Yeah, and you don't necessarily like see it all up there on the screen. Like it looks like, lots of movies of the time in many ways.
I mean, I will say the snow looked really good. That's
right.
Some of the best fake snow I've ever seen. So if most of the budget went towards the fake snow, kudos.
Well, there's a story there. But I think one of the reasons why it did cost so much was that they built the entire town.
Oh, really?
So it's a 4-acre set on the RKO Ranch, 300-yard long Main Street, 75 stores, 20 full-grown oak trees that they moved and built this town out of, right? So like that, I think probably was a lot of it. There is also the snow, which was sort of innovative at the time. And then on top of that, I think it seems like there was a lot of stuff in post as well that may have contributed to the cost. And then in the end, it only makes about $3.3 million at the box office.
Oh,
so
wow.
it doesn't make back its budget. The production company goes out of business, but it gets pretty good reviews. Not great, but kind of mixed. And it's nominated for a bunch of Oscars. It only wins one, which is a Technical Achievement Award for the snow.
Oh,
wow.
Okay. There you go.
There you go. They basically invented a new way of doing movie snow. Because, get this, before this, it was painted cornflakes that they would drop.
Wow.
And
that would have been loud.
Yeah, well, and that was the problem, is that it was very loud. It was like you would step on them and it would crunch and make all this noise. And so they invented a new way of doing it that actually used basically like soap and chemicals and stuff to kind of create the flakes, which I think is basically how they still do it on a lot of sets. And like when you go to an event or something where they have fake snow, that's what it is, right? If you're in LA or whatever. And it was using all this post-war technology. So it was like right after the war, they were taking advantage of all the new stuff and inventing this new thing. And it allowed them to do all those elaborate snow scenes. Because again, this was shot in LA. And that's why Jimmy Stewart's sweating in some of those scenes.
That does explain it. So even the ice scene with his little brother, was that also shot like...
That I don't know for sure.
Okay. Because there are moments that look like real wintertime. And I've always had this, I think part of it is growing up in Canada where like we actually have seasons, and like most films are made by Hollywood executives where they live in LA and they don't have seasons. But I am always like in love with movies that feature snow, because like winter is such a long period, especially in Canada. Like our winters can be very, very long. So seeing that reflected on screen is, I get a little nice, like little warm glow in my heart whenever I see like winter.
Yeah. Snow looks magical on cinema.
I mean, snow is beautiful, and it like when it's lit beautifully. Like one of my all-time favorites, the girl with the dragon tattoo. Like snow has never looked more inviting and appealing, and also more like bone-chillingly cold.
Right.
I don't think I would describe that movie as inviting and appealing.
Well, no, the movie isn't. But like Sweden seems really nice. I want to go visit.
Snow looks great.
Snow looks great.
Yeah, but what's interesting too is that like that's always one of the things that I loved about The Simpsons, was that they would have these sort of seasonal episodes where like winter is actually shown and represented, and not necessarily just for Christmas. You know, you got like the Mr. Plow episode. You have episodes that focus on snow but aren't just the one-off Christmas episode like most sitcoms. So yeah, I don't know. I've always loved seeing snow on film, and this is gets it ticks that box. It's got great snow. Good fake snow.
Well, so the way that this movie actually finally becomes popular is due to a clerical error.
Okay.
So basically, in 1974, production company screws up and doesn't renew its copyright on the movie. Right. And so the result is that TV networks can air it for free.
Oh, wow. Right. That makes a lot of sense.
And so they do. Everyone airs it, like constantly throughout December. And apparently I was reading some articles looking back on the TV history of this. By the 1980s, no matter where you lived, in the United States at least, it was playing nearly every day throughout December.
Wow.
So you could always find it on, right? Which is why everyone watched it, why all the Simpsons writers watched it growing up probably and were familiar with it, right? It was just everywhere during December. And apparently in 1992, this is wild, I did not know this at all before reading this, It's a Wonderful Life became the first American program ever to be broadcast on Russian television, reaching over 200 million Russians.
Wow.
There you go.
So there you go. So in other words, it's a TV hit. That's kind of the bottom line. But then what happens is, about almost exactly 20 years after the clerical error, right, in 1993, a Supreme Court case allows Republic Pictures to reclaim the rights. And so after that, it's no longer on every television network anymore. It's only on NBC.
It's so funny because, like, again, I don't remember this ever being on as a kid. Like,
right.
I distinctly remember, at least when we were in like high school or whatever, like TBS would always have a Christmas Story marathon. Do you guys remember that?
Yeah, 24 hours straight.
24 hours of A Christmas Story, which ironically still never watched the movie until like I was in university. But I just like distinctly remember always seeing the ads for A Christmas Story, and like I think it's a similar thing where like they must have just had the broadcast rights and they're like, we're gonna just milk this for all it's worth.
In Canada, like I remember CBC airing it, and I remember it would air on Christmas Eve.
Yeah, this feels like a movie CBC would air.
Yeah, so like I had a way of watching it like on VHS or DVD, but I remember whenever we went like to a family member's house on Christmas Eve for dinner, we'd turn on the TV and like, It's a Wonderful Life is on CBC. It would be airing like at 8 o'clock at night. That would be like the Christmas Eve movie they would play.
Totally.
I wonder if they still do.
But it's so interesting, Nate, because like so much of what we've discovered, through doing this show is that like these movies that aired constantly on TV tend to be these movies that the Simpson writers have this deep knowledge of, because prior to the home video market, that was how you rewatched movies over and over again. They would air them annually, and like that's what my dad said about The Wizard of Oz, The Sound of Music. These perennial films that you knew, they're going to air it this year. I can't miss it. This is going to be my opportunity to see it again, which for our generation, it's just not a thing. And certainly for the generations after us.
Yeah, everything's accessible all the time.
Yeah.
Exactly. Like
I remember like, again, growing up, Sunday night would be like the magical world of Disney. And it'd be like, oh my God, this movie, Monsters, Inc. is premiering tonight. Like, it's been such a, like, you've been waiting for like, whatever film it was. It's like, having it premiere on TV was such a big deal. And I haven't thought about that until this very moment. I'm like, wow, like, it's so true. Like, that was such a moment in time where you would wait for something to be available. Like, well, once it was on TV, like, that was a big deal.
Yeah.
Well, and it's funny. I was talking with my parents this weekend about the Disney Vault, like how it was a huge deal when a film was finally released from the vault, and you could go out and buy your overpriced $45 VHS in a plastic clamshell.
Oh yeah.
Which my parents still have all of them, and as my dad said, yeah, they're just taking up space in the closet, like because we don't even have a VCR to watch these on, but we still have them for whatever reason. So
I mean, so the end result is that this movie ends up becoming kind of like this classic for a whole generation, multiple generations of people. And in the end, Frank Capra was sort of like, this is his favorite movie that he's ever made. Jimmy Stewart says it's his favorite role he's ever played, right? And I have this quote from Frank Capra that I liked that kind of sums it up. But he says, "It's the damnedest thing I've ever seen. The film has a life of its own now, and I can look at it like I had nothing to do with it. I'm like a parent whose kid grows up to be president. I'm proud, but it's the kid who did the work. I didn't even think of it as a Christmas Story when I first ran across it. I just liked the idea."
See? It's not a Christmas movie.
Well,
from the mouth of the director, Nate.
So even the interesting thing about the short story guy too. That story takes place on Christmas Eve, right?
Yeah. And that would be a Christmas movie.
No.
Oh, here we go.
He says that it's also not a Christmas story because apparently the author was actually, it's very ambiguous in all the writing I've seen of it, but he was of mixed religious background. So to him, he was like, this actually is non-denominational.
Yeah, it's
which
just
is
December
like,
24th.
Right? Yeah, it's just December 24th. And it's a mysterious stranger on a bridge, not an angel.
Yeah.
So, he saw it as this sort of like universal tale. I don't know. I think that's kind of shaky ground, but that's the way he saw it too, was that it was kind of more about the opportunity to kind of have this perspective on your life that you wouldn't get in your normal day to day. So should we jump into the actual movie itself? I feel like we've done a lot of
Yeah, let's dig into it. We usually like to start this conversation by talking about the performances that sort of spoke to us. So Daniel, what was your favorite performance in the film?
I think Jimmy Stewart, you have to acknowledge him first. This is his film. From beginning to end, he has a lock on my heartstrings. And like it could just be like the simplest thing that he does. It's like in the smallest little movements in his face, these little intricacies in his face that you feel everything that his character is feeling. He's the most positive. He wants to help everybody. He's a good person. But you could see that every time he is doing something for the greater good, even though it's not benefiting himself, that's starting to weigh on him. And I think that pays off so much at the end of this film when he does finally have his breaking moment, right? And again, Jimmy Stewart's phenomenal. I love Donna Reed in this film, too. I think she's so lovely. I had such a big crush on her growing up watching this movie. Again, growing up, I'm like, oh, it's black and white, but, they're not that much older than me. And then you're like, oh, never mind. This is, like, long before my time.
They're dead.
She is no longer with us. But also, I have to say, Lionel Barrymore, like, he used to give me such anxiety watching this movie growing up because he is such a bad guy in this movie. He is such a mean-spirited and just awful human in this movie. He would be the guy that you'd want to boo whenever he was on screen.
Are you saying boo or boo-earns? I was saying boo-earns.
And it's funny that, you see a lot of parallels to who his character is to leaders and people in power today. Like, that archetype is alive and well in people. And I think Lionel Barrymore, obviously, from the whole Barrymore family, like, there's a long line of people in that family, but he is so scary as Mr. Potter in this.
Yeah, there's something remarkable about his performance in that it's cartoonish in how evil he is,
right? And
yet he's not playing it cartoonishly, and he still comes off as being incredibly menacing. It's a very fine line, and again, Barrymore is certainly adept at this, and again, tying it back to A Christmas Carol, quite famously played Scrooge in radio adaptations. So he sort of has a lock on that type of character. Obviously, Scrooge has this sort of denouement where he changes his ways, and Nate, like you said, there's an alternative universe where the guardian angel shows up to Mr. Potter, and maybe the story goes in a different way. But yeah, his performance, it resonates off the screen in a way that I was very struck by. As obviously to Jimmy Stewart, Daniel, you put it perfectly when you said, like, this is his film. It is the quintessential Jimmy Stewart movie. The irony being that when I think of Jimmy Stewart, I always think of not necessarily It's a Wonderful Life, but the Jimmy Stewart It's a Wonderful Life reference in The Simpsons, where he's at the bank and, I don't have your money here. It's at Bill's house and at Fred's house. But what I was struck by in this was sort of seeing him in his earlier years with a more youthful vitality, although, as I said to Nate before we started recording, like, the idea that he's supposed to be college age is a real stretch.
Yeah, it's that varsity sweater for sure, like maybe that'll age him down.
Yeah, like, he definitely looks younger than the Jimmy Stewart I remember, but I don't know that I buy that he's supposed to be like 18 years old, especially like when he's first introduced.
There's a lot of actors from that time, I think, that we look and like, man, like, you're supposed to be like 24 years old or something like that, and it's just like, oh no, you actually were, because like everyone was like born old looking, I think, in that.
Yeah, everybody looked so old back then.
Yeah,
I mean, like, the crazy thing too, though, is like that dude also served in the military as well, and like,
for sure,
he had like some crazy life experience like right before this, and probably has PTSD when he's like working on this movie. So like, I think even if you look at the movies he made right before the war and then look at this, you're like, he looks a lot older.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, it's an amazing performance, and his distinctive way of talking, of course, like kind of burns it into your brain.
Yeah.
Like so many of the lines are just like, I hear him saying it. I can't like remove it from his voice, you know, and just
Right.
like his crazy drawl.
Yeah, it's like, I want a big one. You know, like when he wants
Yeah.
the suitcase. Like, it's so distinct.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. It is a phenomenal performance, but not to be outdone by the rest of the cast, because, Daniel, you hit it on your head. You got Mr. Potter, who is menacing as all get out, and Donna Reed, who I literally halfway through the movie texted Nate to be like, I think I have a crush on Donna Reed.
100%.
She's like, it's such a compelling, beautiful performance.
Every time we watch it, the thing that my wife always says is that, like, if you actually pay attention to what's happening in the plot, she actually saves the day. She's the one who, like, fixes everything at the end.
Literally,
of the movie.
yeah.
She's kind of like, and she's got it all under control. She's like raising, how many kids do they have? 3 or 4 kids? And then like rallies the town, like fixes up the whole house. Like she's doing all this stuff in the background that
All
kind
off
of,
camera.
like, is just happening. But yeah, she's like an amazing person in the movie, and it's very, very well played as well. She's very charming and is a good like equal to Jimmy Stewart in the movie too, I think.
Actually, before we move on, you did mention this, Daniel, and it is, I think, the thing that struck me the most probably on this rewatch was Jimmy Stewart's, the section where he finally does snap. It is such a turn because he spends so much of the movie as this sort of like idealized, you know, he's so full of joy and nothing seems to rattle him, but like he reaches this breaking point. And I think that's so integral to the film working, because you have to believe that he's at his wit's end, that he would contemplate suicide. And that's where you're glad that you have an actor like Jimmy Stewart, because that so easily could like tip over into melodrama or tip over into just overacting, not being believable. And then when he catches himself and he's like, I'm sorry, you know, play your song and I owe you an apology too. Like, it's this beautiful moment of seeing someone who just, he has hit his breaking point.
Right.
But then he pulls himself back and tries to save face. And then, you know, again, I can't remember exactly what the line is, but Mary basically says like, can't you leave the kids out of it or something?
Yeah, why do you have to
that
torture
effect.
them?
Why do you have to torture them? Yeah, and it's just like, as a dad myself, that was just such, oh my God.
The thing that gets me about that scene is that he apologizes, but it's too late. He's already scared them. Right.
Exactly.
And I feel like this is actually another sort of parallel with The Simpsons, where it's like, there are episodes where Homer kind of maybe doesn't like get angry, but like does things where he really screws up, right? And you have to still be sympathetic with him, but also be mad at him, and finding that sort of sweet spot is so delicate. And I feel like The Simpsons also hits it sometimes with, yeah.
I would say more often than it being Homer, it's Bart.
Or Bart,
Because
yeah, too. True.
you know, the thing that this film really struck a chord with me is it reminded me of some of those Simpson episodes that are so hard for me to watch because they pack such an emotional punch. I'm thinking specifically about the episode Marge Be Not Proud, where Bart shoplifts Bone Storm and then basically like, you know, has to admit to his mom that he's been banned from the store because he was caught stealing. And like the performances in that are so emotional and so heart-wrenching. And like, again, it's a cartoon and like I get so wound up. And then I think it's Miracle on Evergreen Terrace where he burns down he burns down the tree and then has to admit like, no, robbers didn't steal. Like, this is all my fault. Like, I'm responsible for this. And you have that sort of push and pull of like, you feel sorry for him, but you're also like mad at him because he's not telling the truth and he's letting things get out of hand. And again, it's packing this emotional wallop that you would not expect from a 23-minute animated cartoon.
Right.
But it has these ups and downs. As Nate says, it's like 70% misery to then at the very end sort of like turn it all around and everything's going to be okay and end it with a gag. So, but that sort of parallel while I was watching this, like even though I do take issue maybe with how it's structured in some ways, does feel very much like those Simpson episodes.
Totally. Well, on that note, should we dive into some highlights throughout the movie?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, so I got to start this off because you sort of alluded to this, that you weren't sure about the structure and like the thing that everyone remembers is at the end. So my take on that is that this movie's like a giant Rube Goldberg machine, right? So it's like the first 2/3 are sort of setting all the pieces up, right? All of the different doodads that all link to each other. And then that last chunk is watching the Rube Goldberg machine actually like do its thing, right? Go off.
Right.
And so like, you know, all the stuff with his childhood and you know, meeting Mary and getting stuck and all this stuff and meeting all of these characters and seeing their trajectories, like that's all part of, you know, allowing the movie to have this like impact in the last third where it just kind of like shows you what happened to all of these people you've grown attached to. So like I think that's the part of the magic of it, but it does take a long time to get there, and every time I rewatch it I'm like, oh right, and then all of this happens and then this happens, you know, like
well, I mean, I literally took note in my notes. I was like, it's an hour and 15 minutes before Christmas is actually introduced in this so-called Christmas movie.
Adam's obsession.
This is a movie that is 2 hours and 10 minutes, which, as we know, I am a strong advocate of no movie should be longer than 90 minutes, so we're already on shaky ground. But okay, 2 hours and 10 minutes, hour and 15 before Christmas is introduced, but it's then an hour and 40 minutes before Clarence actually appears on screen.
Yeah.
The so-called other main character of the film, or at the very least, like, driving force of the most important part of the movie, does not show up on screen until an hour and 40 minutes into this 2 hour and 10 minute movie.
It's a bold choice.
He had a long trip from space, you know? Like, he was out there in his spaceship, I guess, and just flying to Earth.
Yeah, fair enough.
Hanging out with Joseph and Franklin.
Yeah, like, I'm with you, Nate, in that I understand why structurally you need to have the setup, because you're right, for the payoff of You Never Were Born and here's the impact, you need to understand that. And I think what's interesting is that when sitcoms do this, the one sitcom that I vividly remember doing a parody of this is That 70s Show, which, Daniel, you don't know this about me, but when Nate and I were in high school, my nickname was Foreman, because I reminded so many people of Eric Foreman.
That's great.
So That 70s Show and I were very close.
Hello, Wisconsin!
But I think it's a couple seasons in, and it's basically after Eric and Donna have broken up, and Eric is very despondent. And I don't even think it's a Christmas episode. I think it might be the season premiere of the season after Eric and Donna break up, which is, again, an interesting choice that they choose to parody It's a Wonderful Life, not for their Christmas special, because it's not a Christmas movie. I'm not going to let this go. But they do the whole thing, and they're able to sort of say, like, I wish I had never been born. But what's interesting is that they can get away with doing that because they've had 4 or 5 seasons to set everything up.
Right.
So you understand that impact. So you're right. You do need to have a considerable length for that to have any meaning. But it's still, like I said, the thing that everybody remembers from this movie doesn't happen until the final act, which is an interesting choice. But I don't know how else to do it.
Yeah, and I think that there are actually some great moments in the setup. Like, that's the thing that I think for me carries this movie, is that like each scene is like this self-contained story that has snappy dialogue, great acting, an emotional arc to it. You're getting like a nice little like jewel of a scene every time, like pearls on a string, right? That lead you along to the ending. So like one of my favorite early scenes is the scene with Mr. Gower, right? Who's the pharmacist. Mm-hmm. There's kind of a whole setup there, but basically like George works for Mr. Gower, and he finds out that like Mr. Gower is going to accidentally poison someone, basically. And there's this whole back and forth. He goes to the bank to see his father, and you're introduced to Potter and blah, blah, blah. But the scene where he comes back to the pharmacy and he decides to confront Mr. Gower and tell him that he's going to poison someone, that's the first time I cry in this movie, because it's a kind of a horrifying scene, actually.
Why didn't you deliver him right away? Don't you know that boy's very sick?
You're eating my store here.
You lazy loaf.
Mr. Gower, you don't know what you're doing. You put something wrong in those capsules. I know you're unhappy. You got the telegram and you're upset. You put something bad in those capsules. It wasn't your fault, Mr. Gower. Just look and see what you did. Look at the bottle you took the powder from. It's poison, I tell you, it's poison. I know you feel bad.
Oh.
Don't hurt my story again. Don't hurt my story again.
Oh, George.
Oh, Mr. Gower, I would never tell anyone.
Oh, Jesus.
Whew. Powerful.
Both of those performances are unreal, I think.
Yeah, I was struck by maybe that was not the best term to use.
Oh.
I was shocked when that scene happened because I didn't remember that from having seen it 10 years ago or 11 years ago or whatever. And just even like the sound effect that they use, it's so like aggressive and just like.
Well, I think I read something that actually he really hit the kid.
I wouldn't be surprised.
I wouldn't be surprised either. But yeah, like the moment of realization on his face when he tastes it and he has like these big watery eyes. And, you know, we learned in the movie as well, too, that he had a letter that his son passed away as well, too. So like he's obviously not thinking clearly and he's kind of shaken out of whatever mindset that he was in. And yeah, I'm right there with you, Nate. That is a moment that like even just watching it now, it's so moving and it's so sad, but it's so powerful.
Well, and this kid who, like, has the bravery to confront an adult about something really serious, and then, like, he sticks it out while he's being physically assaulted, and then still forgives him and says he'll never tell anyone is, like, whew, it's a lot. The other thing that, again, like, speaking to how this movie hits me differently every time I watch it, the thing I picked up on in 2020 was that his son died during the influenza epidemic.
Right, the influenza epidemic, yeah. Right.
There's like all these moments throughout this movie that sort of like touch history, right? Like that, and and of course the Depression and the war. But yeah, that was another one of those ones that like the year that I watched it at the beginning of COVID, I was like, oh
yeah,
God, yeah. So that's when the tears start flowing.
And they tie together so nicely, right? Because you have that moment later on in the film where nobody knows who George is, and they're in the bar and he's there too, and you're just like, oh, like, no, this guy's been in jail. Get him out. That's how you know him. You guys have been in jail together. And it's just such a moment that has such a great payoff because of this early scene.
Totally. And the bartender shoots him in the face with seltzer. It's just so cruel.
That moment was so heartbreaking because it's like he's this feeble old man.
So degrading.
As much as I'm criticizing the structure of the film, I'm not really criticizing it because, again, I don't think there's any other way to do it. And you need it for those payoffs. Like maybe it's just there's too much of it in that first 2/3, but
this is Adam's take on like every movie, but I think it's just he's got an editor's eye, so it's always like
totally fair.
You can trim it a little here and there.
Yeah, you don't need all of these stories. Like we don't need to hear about both Bert and Ernie, which like no, it's fine. It's fine. Look, I didn't make a $3.7 million successful movie that's withstood this test. Well, we don't know. Maybe 80 years from now, this podcast will be. But
wow, we'll see about that. Daniel, do you have any favorite moments from the sort of this early part of the movie, like when he's a kid and in high school and all of that?
Right off the bat in this movie, I love the scene of them just sledding. Because still to this day, my dad will always be like, hee-haw. Like, that's still something that he says, like, throughout the year that's associated to this movie. But I love George and Mary, their scenes together. I love their dance when the gym floor opens up. And, the actor who plays Alfalfa from, like, the Little Rascals is there. And he, like, opens the floor up and they fall in.
Oh, that's who that was.
Yeah, that's him. That's him.
I was like, why does he look familiar? I never put that together that's okay.
Yeah, he also has like another weird cameo in White Christmas, which is another one that I grew up watching where like Rosemary Clooney and Vera, blanking on her last name right now, but like he's their brother. They're saying like, oh, we're going to meet him, but it's just a picture of him. But it's a weird cameo. But yeah, weird cameo in this one as well too. But I love that sequence, and then the walk home. And, that whole sequence of, you want the moon, Mary? I'll throw a lasso around it.
What is it you want, Mary? What do you want? You want the moon? Just say the word and I'll throw a lasso around it and pull it down.
And it's just like, that's so iconic to me. I love that scene so much. And it's one of my favorite sequences in this film.
Adam might remember that actually at our wedding, we had buttons printed and one of the buttons has that line on it. We had like a couple different sort of movie lines, but I love that scene so much as well.
Adore it.
Although Buffalo Gals, I could that's like stuck in my head now.
Oh yeah,
forever.
Literally, as I was, because Nate needed me to send him a copy of the film to pull these clips, and as I was like putting the Blu-ray into my Blu-ray reader, I was like, like it's just it gets stuck in your head and
Always.
It won't leave. And yeah, no, I would agree that like for me that sequence with George and Mary, that sort of first date, as it were, It's such a beautiful moment. It's another one of those scenes that's in the wrong hands could so easily tip over into like overly saccharine and silly and just like eye-rollingly bad. And yet they play it pitch perfectly, and it's so sweet. And then the callbacks to it throughout the rest of the film, you know, when he comes over to her house later and she's playing the Buffalo Gals on the record player, or
and she has the picture of him lassoing
the illustration.
the moon.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Like there's these lovely little callbacks to this moment that clearly was sort of what solidified their relationship. It's just,
this movie is all about that sort of setup and payoff, like again and again.
Exactly.
And again.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I also think like this is the first scene I think that we see at night, and like all of the cinematography at night in this movie is so beautiful. I just think they managed to get such a great contrast.
Oh, yeah.
Partly like what they're wearing, and like, you know, the flowers are really like quite bright in the scenes, even though it's like nighttime. I just love that in that scene as well.
Do you guys watch the colorized version of the film, or do you, when you rewatch it, do you watch the black and white? I'm curious what your preference is.
I usually rewatch it in the black and white.
I bought the 4K Blu-ray at Walmart for $7 one year. I was like, this can't be actually how much this cost. And then when they like rang it through and it was $7, I'm like, okay. So the 4K disc is, it's the black and white version, but then the Blu-ray, which we are using for our clips, that's colorized. And I've never understood the idea of colorizing black and white films, and it's such a weird thing to me because like it never really looks good. Even like with top of the line modern technology, like it still looks like it's been colorized, but maybe we'll get there eventually. Again, it's one of those, Nate's right, like the cinematography is so arresting. Like I don't think it suffers from being in black and white. It centers it in a time and a place. Like you sort of associate black and white with a certain era, and this film obviously evokes that era very much so, that sort of post-war, post-depression time. But you know, it's funny, Nate, you alluded to earlier that like the $3.7 million isn't necessarily up on screen, and I don't know that I agree. Like it looks really good for what it is. It doesn't need to look this good considering that it's a fairly straightforward kind of movie.
You like, so I watched for the first time You Can't Take It With You in like preparation for this because number one, it's of course another Frank Capra movie. It's his comfort zone movie that I was referring to earlier. And it also has Jimmy Stewart, Lionel Barrymore, and Jean Arthur as well. And she was going to play Mary's role. And it feels like a play up on the screen, right?
Yeah.
It's proscenium sets. It's very flat lighting. You know, it's basically just like you set up the camera and then the actors and actresses do their thing.
Yeah.
And this movie so does not feel like that. It's such a cinematic movie, right? And it's, you know, like even that scene you mentioned, Daniel, where he goes, I want a big one, right? That freeze frame is like one of the early freeze frames in like cinematic history.
Okay.
Capra was beat out apparently by Hitchcock with Champagne. But
a film I've never heard of.
Never heard of it. 1928.
Wow.
Oh, okay. So it's probably one of his like early silent films. Yeah.
Yeah.
But like, you know, it's still like early days for those kinds of techniques, and the snow and even just like the angles and the lighting is so moody and interesting compared to like some of the other movies that even Frank Capra's made. So
yeah, the scene at the end when he's like running down the street, like it's the iconic scene that's shown in, you know, I think it's like that scene and then the other most iconic scene from the movie, the Every Time a Bell Rings scene.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's just like this is a much better looking movie than it probably has any right to be.
Yeah.
Because again, even my favorite Christmas movies now, like they're not particularly like beautiful films. I was struck by how good looking this is. Nate, what's one of your favorite scenes in this?
Yeah, I mean, I love the end of this part of the film, like right before he decides to stay and take on the building and loan thing, right? They have the board meeting where Mr. Potter's like, I vote that we dissolve this building and loan, blah, 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 right? And but the thing that's amazing about that scene, again, this is the second time I cry, is when George makes his impassioned speech about like why the building and loan matters, and he's sort of saying that like this rabble you're talking about, they're the ones who do most of the working and paying and living and dying in this town, and you know, couldn't they do most of that paying and working and living and dying in a decent home? And that line
with a bath. Yeah,
a home with a bath. Yeah, I mean, like, that's the line that gets me, and that is pure Capra. That is, like, exactly the kind of stuff that he puts into all of his movies. You know, it's in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. It's even in You Can't Take It With You, like, all of those sort of subtexts of, like, you know, big banks and, like, and people trying to make their way and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. So,
and it's the second time we get to see George stand up to Mr. Potter as well, too, right? So it's like he still has, like, that fire against him, which is great. You see him do it as a kid, and then you see him do it now after his father isn't there to hold him back from speaking out, which is a really nice callback to that.
Well, and then you have, again, speaking to Stewart's incredible performance in this, you know, shortly thereafter when the, I don't know if it's the head of the board or wherever, but like basically comes down and says they're going to keep the building in loan. The board voted against Potter. The only stipulation is that, like, you have to run it, George. And, like, there's this look on his face. It's just such a beautiful piece of acting because you can completely read the sort of conflict that he's feeling of, like, well, I don't want to do this, but this is my only choice. And, like, I want to, you know, live up to my father. And, like, it's an amazing moment that's all in facial reaction. Like, it's incredible.
I mean, and it certainly helps that, like, it's an extreme close-up, right?
Yes.
It's like, which they do a couple times throughout this movie where you could just really see nothing but Jimmy Stewart's face and, like, doing all sorts of, like, pretty wild things. So then we kind of, like, go into the next part of the movie, right? We have the part where they kind of, like, finally get together, right? Mary and George.
Right. Yeah.
And that's another, like, there are a couple really excruciating scenes. Usually it's when George is being a total asshole.
Right.
And the scene where he, like, goes to her house and is just being, like, this grumpy piece of shit.
It's not fun to be around. Always one of the scenes that made my stomach hurt growing up.
Yeah, exactly. But then by the end of it, he's, you know, they have that call with Sam Wainwright where he's, like, telling him about plastics, and they, like, and that's when they fall in love, basically.
Right.
It's a weird scene. There's a lot of scenes where there's, like, a lot of different things happening in quick succession. Because, like, that whole sequence is, like, his brother comes home, and he finds out that he's married and he's not going to run the building alone. They have a welcome home party, and then he, like, walks over to Mary's house, and then they talk to Sam, and it's just like all of this stuff is happening, and that's all, like, one sequence.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That scene is pretty rough. And then you just, like, cut to their wedding. You know?
In the pouring rain. At first I was like, are people just throwing, like, an obscene amount of rice? And then it's like, no, it's just like, it's pouring rain. It's crazy how much rain there is for that sequence.
It's an interesting choice. I don't love, like, reading too much into things, but it does feel kind of like par for the course in this movie of, like, you know, of course it would rain on their wedding day.
On George's everything.
Totally.
There's always going to be something that's going to go wrong for George. Like, and even in the scene when I was talking about earlier with, he had an amazing night with Mary. They danced the night away. They had a wonderful moment together. 5 seconds later, car pulls up. Oh, your father had a heart attack. It's like, anytime there is something good happening in his life, it is immediately taken away from him. Right?
Yeah, totally. Yeah. There's always, like, 5 things going on at once.
Yeah.
But then, like, this is actually, I think, maybe the first Simpsons reference, maybe, in the movie. They get in the back of the car, the cab, right? And George is telling the cabbie all about, like, this amazing honeymoon that they're going to be on.
Well, what we're gonna do, we're gonna shoot the works. A whole week in New York, a whole week in Bermuda, the highest hotels, the oldest champagne, the richest caviar, the hottest music, and the prettiest wife.
Wow, that does it.
I love the reaction, too. But
the oldest champagne.
Yeah. And again, like, that feels like the sort of, like, Dashiell Hammett-y, like, snappy dialogue thing, but can you play the Simpsons version of this, I think?
Yes, I certainly can.
Whoa! What, Marge? This will be the greatest night of your life. I've been saving up for a new engine for my car, but I'm going to spend it all on us. I'm renting the biggest limo. I'm going to buy you the biggest corsage. My tux is going to have the widest lapels, the most ruffles, and the highest platform shoes you ever saw.
So that's from The Way We Was, season 2. And that's one of those ones where it's not anywhere on the internet that I can find that that's actually a reference. They don't say it on the commentary. But, like, after having watched It's a Wonderful Life so many times and then rewatching that episode, I was like, that's gotta be a reference, right?
Yeah,
like, it just seems so specific. And it's such a funny riff on that reference, too.
Oh, yeah.
The widest lapels.
Well, and then shortly thereafter is when there's the run on the bank, and then everybody goes
Right.
to the building and loan, and that's where we get the moment that, when I think of Jimmy Stewart, but also when I think of It's a Wonderful Life, I think of this scene from The Simpsons.
You mean the bank is out of money? Insolvent? You only have enough cash for the next 3 customers? Hey, what's
Just a second here. No, I don't have your money here. It's in Bill's house and Fred's house.
Hey, what the hell you doing with my money in your house, Fred? Ugh.
That's so good.
Yeah.
Springfield mob mentality. It's
Always.
It's good stuff.
Yeah. You feel a bit of that in this movie too, that like the town either is going to like come together to like, see you out of town, or they're going to like, give you a bunch of money. It's hard to say, but they all kind of like have this mentality, right? Like there's that scene where he tries to pick up Violet on the street and like go on a date. And then like by the end of the conversation, like there's a crowd gathered around them laughing at him, But yeah, so that's, I think, is the first sort of like section where you start getting these Simpsons references, right? So they don't only do the end.
No.
There's
no,
like
for
that,
sure.
at least that chunk in the middle that I don't know. It is kind of a weird, like I definitely did not get that reference growing up at all. Like did not know that was a reference to anything, let alone, It's a Wonderful Life. Because it's kind of an obscure one, right? It's not like one of those parts of the movie that like, oh yeah, that's everywhere. Everyone always references that
Right.
scene.
Yeah, if anything, it's you get that he's doing, like, it's a Jimmy Stewart bit.
Right.
But you don't necessarily immediately clock that it's that specific scene from It's a Wonderful Life.
Right. So yeah, I mean, a lot of stuff happens after this, right? This is the part where like they decide to have a kid. World War II happens, and there's like a whole montage, right, of like all the people going to war.
Yeah, that extremely bizarre section where, like, knowing now that he was a propagandist, I was like, oh, okay, well, this whole World War II section feels a lot more, and I guess also too understanding that this is post-war, and like, so that stuff probably feels
it like literally just happened.
Yeah.
So I feel like they were like, we have to acknowledge it.
yeah, like it's probably a lot less out of place.
But yeah, it's probably my least favorite part of the movie is the whole kind of like war interlude thing.
Right.
But that kind of brings you into like the like crisis moment where the story actually really starts picking up, and you're getting close to the beginning of the movie when everyone's praying for him, right?
Right.
And that's like when Uncle Billy loses $8,000 from the bank because he's making fun of Potter. And I find this whole section excruciating. All of the interactions, there's just this pit in my stomach the whole time. Like, feel terrible for Uncle Billy because he's really trying and just can't keep his shit together. Feel terrible for Jimmy Stewart because he's like losing his mind, blowing up at people, blows up at Uncle Billy, who he loves, and tells him he's going to prison and like all this sort of stuff. Begs to Potter. He yells at his family. Like, it's just really awful section to go through.
Yeah, the life insurance thing too, where he's like, the only thing he has as collateral is this like life insurance that he paid $500 on. Like, it's just, they're really like kicking a guy when he's down. And of course, you also have to remember that like he didn't even want to do this to begin with.
Yeah.
Right? Like, he's given up his hopes and dreams, and now, I mean, obviously he eventually comes to terms and comes to love doing what he does because he's helping all these people and all that, but like, this is not where he foresaw himself, and now, his life is about to be ruined as a result. Again, it's a testament to Jimmy Stewart's performance that it is so gut-wrenching and so affecting, because he is able to make these massive swings between, being totally joyous and then just like a man that is completely at his wit's end.
Yeah.
And I think that's what makes Potter so irredeemable as well too. It's because we know that he's the one who found the money, right? And we know, like, us as the audience know that he has it. So when you see George going to him to plea for a loan, it's what makes it all the more harder to watch, because you're just like, man, like, he has your money and he's still not going to help you. That's how much I loathe this character.
It's so funny, Daniel, because I was convinced that he gave it back. Like, I was like, even Mr. Burns wouldn't keep the money. You know what I mean? Like, that's why he's so villainous. And then he calls the cops and he's like, "You're going to be arrested." And it's like, it's just an obscene level of cruelty.
Yeah. Cops and the reporter at their home later waiting for him to get home.
Like it's just it's just so awful.
I mean, it is interesting because this movie is so much about redemption, and so many other characters do redeem themselves in one way or another. You know, at the very end, even like the journalist and the cop and the bank examiner, they all end up giving money to George Bailey in the end and singing along and all of that. But like, it's interesting that Capra does think, or I mean, this is reading a lot into it, but like, he has a character in this movie that like is irredeemable, cannot actually come around and see the light of day. And it's almost like, I feel like all of those people, like the, you know, the bank examiner and all that, they're kind of like the middle rung people that are kind of just doing their job, right? And like, if given the opportunity, they can turn it around. But it's like he's saying, no, but there are actually people in the world who truly are, you know, malicious people who just want money and don't care about anyone else. And that's why we need people like George Bailey to like stick around and not leave the gaping hole in their community. But yeah, the scene that really captures Jimmy Stewart's sort of performance the most, I think, in this movie is the scene where he's praying at the bar. Again, there's a sort of crazy story behind this, but in an article, actually in a religious journal, because Jimmy Stewart was actually very religious and a Republican, interestingly, he wrote about that scene that, like, basically, well, I'll just read it. He says, "As I said those words, right, the prayer, I felt the loneliness, the hopelessness of people who had nowhere to turn, and my eyes filled with tears. I broke down, sobbing." And the interesting thing is that, like, it wasn't intended to be a crying scene. He wasn't supposed to cry in that take, but he just started doing it naturally. And it was actually, like, the shot is actually from pretty far away. And Frank Capra, there's a lot of stories on set of him kind of recognizing the serendipity and leaning into it. And so he realizes that this is like a really special take, but he also realizes that it may not be like reproducible. So he wanted a close-up. And so Frank Capra's solution was he just like did it all in post. He actually sat there in post and enlarged frame by frame by frame by frame by frame until he got that close-up at the end of that scene. So like that sort of slow zoom in you see is actually all done in post.
That's wild.
Which is like, at the time, again, would have been incredibly labor intensive and probably cost a bunch of money to do. But like he thought that like this performance was worth that extra time to like make the shot work. So I love that scene so much.
That's incredible, because I think at the end of the day, George Bailey's superpower in this film is empathy, right? And I think for better or for worse, whether it gets him to the point that he does at the end of the film, that's still something that he is always going to be that empathetic person. He's always going to be that good person, no matter what, right? He's always going to choose helping rather than not helping. So I think to think like, man, I'm gonna every time I watch that scene now, Nate, I'm going to be thinking about like, damn, Frank was doing this in post. What?
For sure. Well, and like Jimmy Stewart has a lot in common with George Bailey. Like that's the other thing that's really interesting, and I didn't talk about that much, but. So Jimmy Stewart actually studied architecture at Princeton and then decided not to be an architect and became an actor and like went off and did all these things.
Wow.
He's from a small town in Pennsylvania called Indiana, Pennsylvania. After the war, he actually was like, yeah, you know, I think this acting thing's really frivolous. I'm going to go back to Indiana, Pennsylvania and work at my dad's store.
Wow.
And like, so he actually was going to go do that. And Lionel Barrymore was like, look, George, you have a gift and you need to keep doing this because you are like an amazing talent and you need to actually like share that talent. And that's why he did this movie. But like, he's almost like Jimmy Stewart's almost this alternate reality, George Bailey, where it's like, what if George Bailey did actually follow those opportunities and left? And so like, I feel like you got to see a little bit of that in this performance too, of like him also looking at this character and being like, this is kind of this alternate reality version of me, and he was going to go back to his father's business to run it. Like, he clearly has that in him too, right? Like, as a person, that's drive to be there for other people and just the value of family, community, all that kind of stuff. So, anyway, it's a very interesting scene, and it gets me every time. That's like, I don't know, 3 or 4 cry.
Yeah, I was going to say, what's the cry count at this point of the film?
I'm not sure. So anyway, so that's finally what sort of leads him off to the bridge, I guess, right? Again, like this is where the cinematography is just like amazing. More night cinematography, the snow's in full force. And then he looks down at the water, and the water's like, you know, again, such high contrast, like black and white, just kind of like ebbing and flowing. And then we get introduced to Clarence, finally.
He decides to join us, finally.
Yeah.
An hour and 40 minutes into the film.
Yeah.
And an hour and 40 minutes into this podcast. So it lines up nicely.
There you go.
Oh, there you go. Look at that. This has actually been a live commentary.
Yeah, exactly.
We just didn't tell you.
So he shows up. I mean, what do you think about him in this? I don't even know what the actor's name is, actually, off the top of my head.
I mean, I think he's adorable. Like, I love when he's in the bar and trying to decide what to order. Yes. And he's like, a hot buttered no, I can't get that. And it's just, but it's also, like, definitely a performance that could only exist in this era because, like, it is so... It's not... Over the top isn't the right word, but, like, it's such a character actor performance that, like, nowadays just...
Yeah. Unless it's on The Simpsons.
Yeah, exactly. Like,
all of these characters could be on The Simpsons, pretty much.
Yes, but if this movie were remade today, like, that character would have to be played by, like, a Morgan Freeman or, like, you know, one of these, like, venerable, like, Hollywood royalty.
Right.
Whereas in this, it's just kind of like this goofy, chubby, schlubby doofus who... you know, is just trying to get his wings. And I think that's why I'm so frustrated that Clarence doesn't show up for an hour and 40 minutes, because it's like, nah, he rules. Like, I don't know. Like,
I think any longer and he would have overstayed his welcome, in my opinion.
Maybe that's true.
It's like
maybe that's
just
true,
enough.
But...
It's funny, though, Henry Travers, who plays Clarence in this, he's also in The Bells of St. Mary's, which is the film that is playing as George is running through the street in this film as well, too, which is a nice little Easter egg that they have for us in this film.
That's fun.
Yeah.
That's fun.
But Clarence is cool. I mean, like, he has a very distinct voice, which I think is interesting when you pair it with Jimmy Stewart, who has another very distinct voice. So them going at it is a lot of fun. And
one of my favorite little moments that I think is just such a beautiful little touch is when George is like, I wish I was never born. And he's like, okay, I'll grant you your wish. And he goes, say that again. And he's like pointing to his ear. And he's like, I haven't heard out of that since my brother had his accident.
The beginning
and
of the
like,
Rube Goldberg machine, my friend.
Yeah, but it is a beautiful, like, subtle, blink and you miss it kind of thing of like, no, this is how you know that everything has now immediately changed. You don't need the sound effect, like the magical sound effect or whatever that you'd have in a Disney movie. It's a very subtle, like, instantaneously everything has changed.
Yeah.
And then, it, like you said, Nate, now the snowball has begun to roll down the hill and we're going to see the impact of George no longer existing.
But before we do that, do you recall Homer's guardian angel on The Simpsons?
Colonel Clink?
Yes. Well, first, it's Isaac Newton.
You're Isaac who?
Right.
He shows up, and then I think it's the episode where Homer is, like, contemplating cheating on Marge, and then, you know, he has this moment where he's in the phone booth and he tips over and sees his guardian angel, and it's kind of a mashup between, like, It's a Wonderful Life and A Christmas Carol, because there's, like, a scene after that where they're flying over the scene, which is very A Christmas Carol, and then if I recall correctly, he's actually very happy in the fantasy with Mindy, and Marge is the president of the United States.
Yeah, it worked out well for everybody.
Yeah.
This dream is over.
It's funny too because later in the series when Homer goes on his hunger strike and Cesar Chavez shows up and he's like, "Why do you look like Cesar Romero?"
Because you don't know what Cesar Chavez looks like.
So clearly, when guardian angels visit Homer, they have to be very specifically tailored to his knowledge.
That's so good.
So anyway, this is where we actually get into the I wish I was never born sort of fantasy. Again, like, so much happens, actually, like, moment to moment. Like, you basically encounter every character that you've encountered in the movie again. Like, all sorts of, like, scenarios, locations revisited, and everything's different. And it's just this constant, like, cycle of payoffs. But are there any that really stuck with you out of the shocks that he experiences?
I mean, we alluded to it earlier. The Mr. Gower thing is obviously like the
Oh.
one that packs the biggest wallop. I do love the sort of payoff that we're getting here of like, you do start to realize that, yes, it's the major characters in this story, but then also some of these other characters that just sort of have flitted in and out of his life.
Who've all been
They're
touched
all,
by
you know,
George still, though, right?
Exactly. And that's what I think is so beautiful about it, is that it's not just, Mary or his brother or his parents. It's also these little side characters that Bert and Ernie, like these people that aren't really integral to the plot, but ultimately are integral to his life, or he's integral to their lives, I should say.
Yeah, totally.
This section also, I think, a movie that owes a huge debt to this, and it sort of like immediately popped up in my mind as I was watching it, is Back to the Future. Like this idea of you not understanding the impact that your actions have had on other people, the butterfly effect, as it were, of that we all have on each other's lives.
Yeah, that's a good one. I hadn't thought of that. That's a really good extra credit if you're looking for something else to watch. The thing that always makes me chuckle a little bit is that Pottersville does feel a lot cooler and more fun than Bedford Falls a little bit. Like in retrospect, it's like, oh well, there's like jazz and movie theaters and bars and things.
It's very modern.
Yeah. It's, my coastal elite soul is happy looking at Pottersville.
But then it leads to a really great moment where you see George kind of break the fourth wall a little bit, and he's staring directly down the barrel of the camera as well too, which is another great moment in this film.
And like that's also the moment where you get basically like the moral of the story from Clarence as well,
right?
Where the line is
strange, isn't it? Each man's life touches so many other lives. And when he isn't around, he leaves an awful hole, doesn't he?
I love that line. Like so much more than the ones where they actually use the title of the movie and then they use the title of the book, like the greatest gift, God's greatest gift is life, and
right.
But you had a wonderful life. It's like, no, I think this really gets at it, which is like this idea of like we're all part of this sort of like web of relationships, and if you take that out, like the web just has this huge hole, right?
It reminds me of, Nate, I don't know if you remember in high school, we watched Waking Ned Divine, which is this movie that sort of predisposes like this character dies and then they have this eulogy for him, but he's there. And it is this funny thing of, during the pandemic, we had a family member pass away and we went to the memorial service and all of these wonderful things that were being said about them. And I had another one of those moments where it's like, it's so sad that we have to wait until someone is gone to say all these wonderful things. And does anyone ever really appreciate the impact that they've made on other people's lives because they don't get to be there when all of this is said? And isn't the wonderful thing about this movie that George, in a way, gets to experience that? He doesn't get to hear all the wonderful things that the wonderful impact, but he gets to sort of see the other side, the negative impacts that his not existing has. And I do think that's the beauty of this film. That's, to me, what sort of packs the weight of everything, is just understanding how these little things that we do can really make all of the difference.
What's funny, too, I think for myself, every time I watch this movie, selfishly, I'm like, what would life be like if I wasn't here? And I think this is only human to think like that, right? And I love what you both said, that George gets his wish, but he is getting the negative of everything. There's not really any positives to him not being there, which I think is really important for him to learn in this. And immediately makes him want to be like, get me out of here. Like, I do not want to be part of this anymore. I don't want this fantasy anymore.
Yeah, totally. Well, there is also yet another Simpsons parody of this, which, just to lighten the mood slightly, which is an educational film that they watch in school, which is A World Without Zinc.
I love these bits that they do, the 50s educational films.
Right.
Let's just take a look at A World Without Zinc.
What have I done?
Oh, think again, Jimmy. You see, the firing pin in your gun was made of, zinc.
Come back, Zinc! Come back! Come back! Zinc! Come back! Zinc! Zinc!
I love just this the line delivery on zinc. But yeah, I love that little clip. And of course, that's just the tail end, but he finds out that his car and his phone doesn't work either. So,
but thankfully, George comes back to reality, and arguably the most iconic sequence of the film is, you know, him rushing home and discovering that the town has rallied to basically save the day, as it were. I know we've been counting the number of times Nate's cried, but Nate, does this get you every single time as well?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. On and off, and, you know, for this whole last bit. I feel like not so much the running, but like as soon as he's home and he's like hugging his family, there's like the composition of the shots. Some of these shots is so beautiful where he's like hugging his kids and the kids are kind of like all around him. They look like paintings, right?
Yeah.
And then there's a shot too where Mary comes up the stairs and gives him a hug, and one of the kids is on his back and the other two are around his legs. Like those, oh my God, those just get me every time. Yeah. And then of course, like the singing and everyone giving the money and all the, you know,
Old Lang Syne, everything.
Yeah, and all the characters coming back again. It's like all these payoffs of people you've met throughout the movie chipping in. Gets me every time.
I have to admit that I was chuckling though in this sequence because all I could think of was the sequence in Miracle on Evergreen Terrace where essentially the same thing happens. Like the Simpsons Christmas is ruined because of supposed robbers, and everyone comes back to donate, and Mr. Mr. Burns shows up, and his line is,
"Does anyone have change for a button?"
And I don't know, I think that's hilarious. And so as the scene is playing out, I was just expecting Mr. Potter to show up and ask for change for a button. But as we discussed already, no, he's a horrible human being and he never shows up. But Daniel, you already alluded to this. I think my favorite moment, and the moment that definitely pulled at my heartstrings, was when George gets the Tom Sawyer book from earlier that has the inscription from Clarence of, "No man is a failure who has friends." Watching this movie post-pandemic, which is like a weird thing to say because the pandemic's not really over, but like in 2022 with everything that's gone on, and that line specifically really hits differently because, you know, we sort of experienced a period of, you know, when we were in lockdown where like you couldn't see other people, and like you really started to appreciate just how much human contact and contact with your friends and all of that stuff really, really matters. And so seeing a line like that, like, it resonated with me far more now than I think it would have ever before, because it's not just like one of those like, oh, this is the thesis of the movie lines. Like right. It's something that I actually like truly agree with.
Me too. And I think it's that sequence, it's seeing the inscription on the book, and then you hear the bell ringing. And again, it's just Jimmy Stewart's delivery when he's just like, when he hears the bell rings, like, oh, every time a bell rings, an angel gets to rings, we hear from his daughter. And he's just like, "Attaboy, Clarence." It's just the way he says
so
it.
Perfect.
It's like instant tears go streaming down my face because it's just such a wonderful emotional payoff to this movie. But it's just like every time without fail. When I was rewatching, I'm like, yeah, I think I'm going to hold it together this time. And then it's just like, "Attaboy, Clarence." I'm like, nope. Damn it. It caught me again. It's all it takes.
That's one of those lines that always makes me chuckle a little bit because I always imagine like, okay, let's strip away the music and strip away the context of the movie, and his family's just like hugging him, and then they just hear him go, "Attaboy, Clarence," and they're like, "What? Dad? What did he say?"
It's also funny because my wife came home from work and while I was watching this, and she comes into the room, she's like, "What are you watching?" And she's like, "Oh, are you watching that movie? Every time a bell rings, an angel dies." And I was like, that's not the line. But
not quite.
Yes, that is the movie I'm watching. But yeah, so now every time I watch the movie, I'm going to think, every time a bell rings, an angel dies. That would be a very different sentiment. But
yeah. Well, the other like pretty great parody of this scene is also in When Flanders Failed, when Ned Flanders opens up the Leftorium, and again, it's actually very similar in structure-wise to this movie, where it's like the whole episode is Homer just sabotaging him successfully, and then at the very, very end, he like finally concedes and like helps all of these people come to the Leftorium. And the last like scene where Ned comes up is like a perfect parody of this. Maude is even wearing the same outfit as Mary, and like someone's playing the accordion, and like there's all these little nods to this scene, but it's actually very touching as well. And then there's one last one, which is in Natural Born Kissers, where Bart and Lisa get an alternate ending reel for It's a Wonderful Life, which is labeled the killing spree ending.
Yeah.
Just to put a damper on all of our sappiness.
Well, that brings us to my favorite section of the show, which is what we call the parts that seem like Simpsons jokes but aren't. Daniel, was there anything in this movie that sort of stuck out to you as feeling like maybe be more at home in a Simpson episode?
I think it's one of the ones that we were talking about a little bit earlier. I think the whole dance sequence at the school with the pool, like that seems like just something that, like, Bart would pull, and Bart got the keys to the gym and he's going to open it while people are dancing and they all go in. I feel like that's something that would be right out of a Simpsons episode. Because when you think about it in the context of this movie and what we just finished talking about, where it's like, here's this big emotional payoff, and then it's just like, here's this silly moment where everyone's dancing and falling into a pool. It's so interesting seeing that these come from the same movie.
One of the things that immediately stuck out to me was the scene where Mr. Martini is like leaving his current house to move into his new house. He's got like this thick, like borderline racist Italian accent. And then like a slew of children come out, and it just reminded me of the scene in The Simpsons where Cletus ends up getting too many coupons for the free pretzels, and then he just starts calling out all of his kids.
Come on, Tiffany, Heather, Cody, Dylan.
And he goes on and he lists like the 25 children that he has, and like that was the thing that immediately came to my mind.
Cassidy, Zoe, Chloe, Max, Hunter, Kendall, Caitlin, Noah, Sasha, Morgan, Kira, Ian, Lauren, Hubert, Phil.
Potter is obviously very Burns-esque, and like his toady is very much like Smithers.
Yeah.
You know, just doing as he's told.
I actually think on the commentary that at one point they do say that Burns is actually modeled partly after Mr. Potter. And both in terms of like the character, but also the voice, I think, is also modeled a little bit off of Mr. Potter and Reagan.
Certainly in those early episodes where Burns really is just the evil owner of the nuclear power plant. And obviously, as the show goes on, all these characters become more developed. But yeah, in those early seasons, he really does feel much more like that character. And then I also love the moment when they come home to the house. I guess it's after their wedding. And Donna Reed is cooking a like rotisserie chicken, but she's using her record player as the like means of the rotisserie. I don't know. It's such a silly thing that feels very like Simpson-esque because it's just not realistic.
Definitely.
One of the moments that always gets me, that my wife and I quote to each other all the time, is the part in his sort of fantasy where he's asking Clarence, like, where is Mary? Where is Mary? And he's like, you're not gonna like it.
Yeah.
And then eventually George like gets it out of him, like shaking him and asking. And Clarence is like,
she's just about to close up the library.
So she's just a librarian? Okay.
Right, exactly. Both like the way he builds it up, and then you're like, oh, okay, she's just a librarian.
Yeah.
But also just the delivery
God
of
forbid.
the line is so outrageous.
Well, I also think like her mother, there was a very much like Agnes Skinner to it where she, what are you doing down there? And then Mary, which again, this is surprising for a movie from 1943.
Yeah.
We're making violent love, mother, but like it very much felt like the sort of no mother, just the Northern Lights kind of situation. But well, okay, so we've sort of talked around it. Final verdict. What do we all think? It's a Wonderful Life. Does it hold up? Did we enjoy it? Like I said, I was going into this with a little bit of trepidation, wasn't sure what to expect, but I have to admit that it definitely works. I think it's too long, and I think the structure's a little bit weird, but like it pulled at my heartstrings. It's not really a Christmas movie, but I'm okay with that. Nate, do you still... You cried at least 6 times, so clearly it worked for you.
Yeah, no, it works for me every time. It absolutely is a Christmas movie. And I think it does like tell you a lot about storytelling and The Simpsons and all of that. Like there's so much here to like dig into if you're a fan of The Simpsons. You know, like I'm not a big Christmas movie guy for the most part. Like there's a few that I really, really love. And I love that this one is a little bit dark and a little bit like emotional. Like it makes me appreciate all the things that I have and the people in my life and all of that. And like that's exactly what I want out of the Christmas season. So yes, holds up for me.
Yeah, and I think the other thing too is rewatching it, I should say. I appreciated so much more on this sort of viewing the impact that it had culturally, which I don't think I really picked up the first time I watched it, whereas now I could sort of see those seeds of like, oh yeah, like I see how this show referenced this, or how The Simpsons referenced that, or like how other films have taken moments from that. Like I said, the Back to the Future thing. Like
Right.
I was actually able to sort of chart the genesis and the impact that the film had much better this time around than I did the sort of first time. What about you, Daniel? Like, you said this is one of your favorites, and I'm hoping that it remains that even after dissecting it.
You guys have
to pieces
completely
like this.
ruined this film for me. No. I adore this film, and I think watching it with the lens this time of its relation to The Simpsons was interesting, because you start to see the different character archetypes that you would see in The Simpsons in this town, right? But this movie still holds up for me. I love watching it every year. I do feel very like melancholy after watching it, because even though it is such a hopeful ending, this movie's going to drag you over the coals to get there. But I do think that the payoff is all the more for it, and it's worth it at the end when it comes to it. So yeah, it's a lovely movie, and I totally understand why it is something that has been riffed on and parodied throughout the years, because it is that iconic. And I think when you have something that is that iconic, and I think ahead of its time for 1946, for a lot of what we talked about, it is going to resonate, and it is going to kind of reverberate into not just the film world, but into pop culture. And I think that's what happened with this for sure.
One of the things that we like to do when we do this is offer sort of extra credit, opportunities for people. Is there something that you would offer as a piece of like extra credit? Like, oh, if you love It's a Wonderful Life, but you haven't seen this, you absolutely should check it out. Is there something that comes to mind?
There is, and it's a movie that I kept thinking about weirdly while watching it yesterday, and it's not a Christmas movie, and I think it's going to be very out of left field. But I always think of the movie Click with Adam Sandler, which again, so random to bring up. But when you think of it, it's like that is a movie that it's masquerading as a comedy, but really is a movie about a person who is trying to fast forward through life, the things that he doesn't care about, only for him to realize the things that he was fast forwarding through were the most important. And I saw a lot of parallels while watching it. And if you are looking for something that's like totally on the opposite spectrum in terms of Christmas vibes and everything like that, I would say check it out, because at the end of the day, the themes of the films, they can be very similar. And it is one of those movies that it's such a 2000s ass movie as well too. So forgive me for that, but there's a lot of heart and moments in that movie where I'm like, oh, we are getting very deep and dark when I did not expect it from a comedy, just like you would feel the same in It's a Wonderful Life, thinking of something from a Christmas film. But if you are looking for something a bit more Christmassy, I'd say if you somehow have not watched A Christmas Carol, start with the Muppets version, and that's the only one you need to watch.
Yeah, I was going to say that would be my extra credit. Is like what I maintain is the definitive version of A Christmas Carol. I've gotten into fights with people from work about this because there are a lot of people who they want to pick the Alistair Sim version, which isn't even technically called A Christmas Carol. It's called Scrooge. But like now we're getting pedantic. I don't like that one. And then there's the like borderline unwatchable, creepy motion capture Jim Carrey one, which is just terrifying. Yeah. So yeah, no, my pick is absolutely The Muppet Christmas Carol. It's a little more lighthearted because it's obviously kind of a movie more aimed at children, but it has a lot of the same sort of melancholy there. It rides that line between humor and out dark moments. And it is the one that, like, I saw that movie in a theater with my dad and my grandfather in 1992 when it came out, and I've watched it every year ever since. So it's just the nostalgia factor is definitely there for me. But I do think it is genuinely one of the best adaptations of Dickens' story, and it really gets to the heart of that story in a beautiful way. And it has the Muppets, and the Muppets rule. Like, what can I say? The Muppets are great. So, what about you, Nate?
So I have another one that's like very kind of out of left field here. Jerry Maguire.
Yeah.
And like I was trying to think about like what movie feels this way, right? That like has this same sort of like these moments of like, pit in your stomach, really like awful things, and then these really, really high highs and this sort of redemption story and focused on people and appreciating what you have. And like I feel like Jerry Maguire actually has all of that. And I feel like the other thing is that, I was trying to think about who sort of inherited the like Frank Capra thing, right? Of like these kinds of stories. And like there were a few people we looked at The Karate Kid earlier in this season, and like John G. Avildsen's definitely doing some of the Capra stuff, but he's even more of a kind of like, like feel good underdog story thing.
Right.
But I actually think like Cameron Crowe and James L. Brooks actually probably are the two people that kind of like get at that same sort of like all the feels, you know, and these stories that actually can be really, really funny sometimes, really like awkward and hard sometimes, really uplifting at other times. So I think I would check that out if you're looking for something that just feels like It's a Wonderful Life, but obviously not a Christmas movie.
But also, too, I think, like, to the James L. Brooks point, like, The Simpsons. Like, it really... that was the thing, as I said before, really struck me about this. I can't think of many other shows that really can have that emotional roller coaster in such a compressed time and really kind of come out of nowhere. Because one week can be like a wackadoo crazy adventure where they go to Itchy and Scratchy Land and it's just pure fun zaniness, and then the next week you can do an episode where Bart is shoplifting and his mother basically disowns him. I think that's the magic of the show and why I keep coming back to it over 30 years later, is that no other show sort of is able to move across genres and across styles and across emotions in quite the same way. I can't think of any other sitcom that really manages to do that. Most of them just, you know, they stick to like we're going to keep it funny and maybe there'd be a one-off episode where you know, like a cast member has passed away or whatever and they got to address the elephant in the room. But The Simpsons is always not afraid to change it up stylistically, and I really appreciate that.
For sure.
So. And speaking of appreciating things, Daniel, thank you so much for joining us for our non-denominational holidays fun fest. I hope this was as fun for you as it was for us having you on the show. Is there anything you want to plug while you're here?
First of all, I just want to say thank you to both of you for having me on as the first guest. That is a huge honor for me. I am a big fan of what you guys are doing with this show, and I wish you nothing but success. But in terms for myself, you know, I have a show that I do with Shabazz and Anthony on the Movie Podcast. We release reviews and interviews with people from across the film industry, and we have a weekly show that we do as well where we talk about news. So if you want to follow what we're doing there, you can follow us on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Letterboxd at the Movie Podcast. If you want to follow me, I'm DBABZ, D-A-B-Z, because we're in Canada, and all social media as well too. But yeah, no, this is so much fun. I love talking about Christmas and Christmas movies, and to have it packaged with The Simpsons and with you both, it's been awesome. So I am just so happy and elated to join you today.
Well, we're happy to have you. You guys have been crushing it lately. Like, Nate was sort of blown away at the sheer volume of output because, like, it took us almost a year to put out, 7 episodes? And you guys are putting out multiple episodes a week, and it's incredible what you guys are doing. And everyone should definitely check out the Movie Podcast because if you like our show, I think you'll like their show too.
I think so. I think so.
Yeah. So, and as always, thank you, our listeners, for joining us for this very special episode of the Springfield Googleplex, the movie podcast for Simpson fans. We are on hiatus. We're working on season 2. We have something really fun cooking. We're not going to spoil anything yet, but rest assured we will be back. In the meantime, if you enjoyed what you heard, please leave us a review. Share this episode with the Simpson fans or film buffs in your life. And until next time, Nate.
See you around the Plex.
Yeah, we're going to see you around the Plex because we still haven't come up with a better sign-off. Thank you so much, everyone, and we'll see you in the new year.
Well, folks, that's the end of
the Springfield Googleplex
Non-Denominational Holiday Fun Fest. So have a Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, Kwezi Kwanzaa, a tip-top tet, and a solemn, dignified Ramadan. See you around the Plex.